I wasn't researching fires. I was looking into urban development projects in the early 1900s, infrastructure booms, the massive building campaigns that transformed American cities. But then I found something in the Jacksonville archives that made me stop. On May 3rd, 1901, a fire started at noon in a mattress factory. By 8:30 p.m., 2,368 buildings were destroyed. 146 city blocks burned to the ground. 90% of Jacksonville reduced to ash in 8 hours. That's not the strange part. The strange part is what they found when they started rebuilding. The Great Fire of 1901 is well documented. It started at the Cleveland Fiber Factory on the corner of Beaver and Davis Streets. Workers had laid out Spanish moss to dry for mattress stuffing. Sparks from a nearby chimney ignited the moss around 12:30 p.m. Factory workers tried to put it out. They'd done it before on similar occasions, but this time a strong easterly wind picked up. The fire was out of control within minutes. By 12:35 p.m., a 16-year-old named George Houghton pulled fire alarm box number 57. By 12:45 p.m., Fire Chief Thomas W. Haney arrived with his men. By 12:50 p.m., the roof of the 3-story factory collapsed and the wind grew to 18 miles per hour. The fire created its own weather. Tornado-like winds, swirling flames down the street. A nightmarish dreamscape, according to historians. Jacksonville in 1901 was built almost entirely of wood. Wood frame houses, wood shingled roofs, wooden hotels, wooden churches, wooden everything. And the city had been in a drought. Everything was dry, fire-prone. The fire spread house to house with the rapidity that a man could walk. By 3:15 p.m., the First Baptist and First Presbyterian churches were destroyed. By 3:20 p.m., the Windsor Hotel burned. By 3:30 p.m., the St. James Hotel, the city's largest, was engulfed in flames. The wind changed direction. The fire turned southward. By 4:30 p.m., St. John's Episcopal Church and the Church of Immaculate Conception erupted in flames. By 4:45 p.m., the Armory at Adams and Market Streets crumbled. Munitions inside exploded from the heat. 1 block away, the Duval County Courthouse was gutted. All the real estate records destroyed. To this day, Duval County deeds refer to either current public records or former public records of Duval County, Florida, depending on whether they predate the fire. It's the only county in Florida for which that's the case. Every record of who owned what before May 3rd, 1901 went up in smoke. By 5 p.m., City Hall was ablaze. The Metropolis newspaper building, the Elks Club. People fled to the docks at the end of Market Street, but the docks caught fire. Desperate people trapped as the wooden structures burned beneath them. They jumped into the St. Johns River. Arthur Cummer rescued most of them in his boat. This became known as the Market Street Horror. By 7 p.m., firemen made a stand at Laura Street and managed to save a 12-block section. By 7:30 p.m., the wind subsided. By 8:30 p.m., the flames were under control. The fire had burned for 8 hours. 2,368 buildings destroyed. 146 city blocks. 10,000 people homeless. Only 7 people dead. And that last number is remarkable. 7 deaths in a fire that consumed 90% of a major city. Smoke was visible as far north as Savannah, Georgia. Governor William Jennings declared martial law at 2 a.m. on May 4th. By 10 a.m., emergency meetings were underway. By the afternoon, rebuilding committees had formed. The city didn't wait, didn't mourn, didn't pause. They started rebuilding immediately. Within 2 years, more buildings stood in downtown Jacksonville than had existed before the fire. That's the official story. Swift recovery, American resilience, a city reborn from ashes. But when you look at what they actually built and what they found while building it, the story gets more interesting. Henry John Clutho was a 28-year-old architect in New York when he read about the fire in the New York Times. He saw opportunity, a blank canvas, an entire city needing to be redesigned from scratch. He finished his current projects and moved to Jacksonville. By October 1901, Jacksonville had issued over 1,000 building permits. Clutho won the competition to design the new City Hall, then the Carnegie Library, then the Dial-Up Church building, then dozens more. He brought prairie-style architecture to the south, wide overhanging roofs, horizontal lines, bands of windows, natural materials. Frank Lloyd Wright's modernist vision transplanted to Florida. The St. James Building, completed in 1911, was his crowning achievement. 4 stories, an entire city block. The largest building in Jacksonville, featured in The Western Architect in 1914. It's now Jacksonville's City Hall. All of this is documented. Clutho's work is celebrated. Jacksonville's Phoenix-like recovery is studied in urban planning courses. But there's another part of the rebuilding that doesn't get discussed much: what they built underground. After the fire, 3 of Florida's largest banks built their headquarters buildings next to each other in Jacksonville. All within a few blocks: Atlantic National Bank, Barnett Bank, others. Why cluster together like that? According to Gary Sass, a Jacksonville historian who leads tours of the city's underground, the answer is simple. They could dig down on a hill and not hit water, so they put the money underground, put their vaults underground. No one would suspect that anything was underground, so you would never be robbed. The banks didn't just rebuild above ground, they built an entire network of underground vaults and tunnels beneath downtown Jacksonville. Massive vaults, 30 feet deep in some cases, connected by tunnels running under Hogan Street, Bay Street, Forsyth Street. The vaults were designed to be invisible, or hidden beneath ordinary-looking buildings, accessible only through specific entry points known to bank employees. Your money wasn't in the building you walked into. It was 30 feet underground in reinforced concrete chambers. This wasn't unique to Jacksonville. Many cities built underground bank vaults. But the scale and timing in Jacksonville is interesting, all built in the decade immediately following the fire, 1901 to 1911. During the exact same period that Henry Clutho was redesigning the city above ground with his modernist architecture. Why so much infrastructure underground during this specific period? In 1971, 70 years after the fire, construction began on the Independent Life Building. The site was adjacent to the Main Street Bridge, right on the riverfront where the old docks had been. The building required deep foundations. The construction company, Raymond International, excavated the entire city block to a depth of approximately 30 feet. They drove a massive interlocking metal wall around the perimeter, set up well points every couple of yards. Large diesel pumps ran 24/7, keeping the river out and the water table down, and then they hit something, a steam locomotive, buried deep underground. John C. Christian was 17 years old, fresh out of high school, working as an assistant to the lead superintendent. He was there when they found it. They sunk down the footers for the foundation and hit something underground. Then they started digging to see what they hit, and it turns out there was an underground locomotive. The locomotive is still there. The structural pilings of the building were placed around it. It remains buried beneath what is now the Wells Fargo building. Some people dismiss this as urban legend. But Christian was an eyewitness, Raymond International employee, on site during excavation. His account is specific, detailed, consistent with known facts about the 1901 fire. Here's what likely happened. During the 1901 fire, the entire waterfront was covered in wooden docks. Railroad tracks ran along Bay Street. Rail cars and locomotives serviced the lumber export business that dominated Jacksonville's economy. When the fire reached the waterfront, the wooden docks caught fire. A locomotive, either trying to escape or making a final run to save equipment, was on the docks when they collapsed. The burning timbers fell into the river. The locomotive slipped into the mud, hissing and steaming as the water rushed over it, according to the historical reconstruction. The mud of the St. Johns River swallowed it. Over 70 years, silt and debris accumulated. The riverbank was built up. New construction covered the area. By 1971, the locomotive was buried 30 feet underground. When Raymond International excavated for the Independent Life Building, they found it exactly where it had sunk in 1901. Christian described what else they found. I had the task of locking up the site at 5 p.m. every day, and I spent a lot of time poking around in the rubble. I found a lot of bottles and such. I found it fascinating poking through the char line from the 1901 fire. The char line, the layer of ash and burned material from the fire. 70 years later, it still existed, preserved underground. It smelled as if the fire happened the day before. Think about that. 70 years after the fire, they dig down 30 feet and find the char line from 1901 still intact, still smelling of smoke. What else is preserved down there? The locomotive discovery raised uncomfortable questions. Why wasn't it salvaged? Christian's account. There was even debate about not telling anyone what we discovered while drilling. A few executives from Independent Life came out to the job site and we gave them a few artifacts. A few more artifacts were looted and snuck out by workers. My uncle told me to keep quiet if I ever found anything else. Keep quiet. On a job involving dozens of companies, tremendous coordination, tight schedules, and significant money, stopping to excavate a 70-year-old locomotive would cause delays and cost overruns. So they worked around it, built the foundation pilings to avoid it, told workers to stay quiet about artifacts, and moved on. The locomotive remains buried. The artifacts that weren't snuck out were reburied with the backfill. Whatever else was down there at 30 feet stayed down there. The underground bank vaults tell their own story. The vaults weren't just storage, they were architectural achievements. The Atlantic National Bank vault, built into the dial-up church building, was enormous. The huge vault door still exists. Some of the lockboxes remain locked to this day. Nobody knows the combination, according to SAS. The vault was in use until at least 1955 based on inspection records SAS found. Then it became a trash pit, until SAS started clearing it out and found something else, a mountain of emergency drinking water. Dated 1962. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the underground vaults were converted into bomb shelters. The same deep underground spaces that protected Jacksonville's wealth in 1910 were designated to protect Jacksonville's people in 1962. The vaults connect through a tunnel system that still exists beneath downtown. You can walk through sections of it today. What look like corporate building hallways are actually century-old bank tunnels, built to move money underground without anyone above ground knowing. Built during the exact same period as all the other infrastructure projects we've been documenting, 1900 to 1920. Jacksonville's underground isn't unique. Seattle raised its streets and created the famous Seattle Underground. Chicago raised streets 10 to 15 feet. Cleveland dug tunnels 4 miles under Lake Erie. Cities across America were digging deep and building underground during this exact period. But Jacksonville's situation is different in one key way. The fire created the opportunity to rebuild everything at once, above ground and below. When you're starting from scratch, excavating deep foundations, installing new utilities, you can build whatever infrastructure you want. And Jacksonville built a lot of it underground. Bank vaults 30 feet deep, tunnel networks connecting them, whatever other structures exist down there that we don't know about because they haven't been excavated yet. The railroad tunnels add another layer. The Jacksonville Terminal, built in the early 1900s, included an extensive underground pedestrian tunnel system. The terminal was known as the Gateway to Florida. Thousands of passengers daily, hundreds of trains, the largest railroad station in the South. The tunnels allowed passengers to move between platforms without crossing active tracks above ground. When train service relocated in 1974, the terminal was abandoned, later converted to the prime Osborne Convention Center. But the tunnels weren't filled in. They're still there, buried underground, intact but forgotten, flooded in sections, home to rats and roaches, but structurally sound. Brick-walled passageways large enough to walk through, extending hundreds of feet, connecting areas that are now covered by parking lots and modern development, another whole level of a Jacksonville that exists underground. Accessible if you know where to look. Built during the same period as everything else, 1900 to 1920. Here's the pattern. The 1901 fire destroyed 90% of Jacksonville. The rebuilding happened immediately, faster than should have been possible. Within 10 years, Jacksonville had more buildings than before the fire, plus extensive underground infrastructure, bank vaults connected by tunnels, railroad passages, whatever the locomotive was doing down there 30 feet under what became the riverfront. All built during the same period we keep seeing everywhere else. The same decades when cities raised their streets and buried original ground levels, 250,000 children were moved on. Orphan trains, hundreds of asylums were built. History was standardized and controlled. Cleveland dug deadly tunnels under Lake Erie. San Francisco and Chicago rebuilt after their fires 1900 to 1920. The infrastructure boom period, the period when American cities were transformed, above ground and below. But here's what makes Jacksonville unusual. The fire destroyed the Duval County courthouse and all the real estate records. Nobody knows who owned what before May 3rd, 1901. The land titles, property deeds, ownership documentation, all gone. When rebuilding started, new records were created, new deeds, new ownership. The former public records of Duval County were lost. Only one title company, Title and Trust, had saved abstracts of the old records. They still charge for access to them. So when the rebuilding happened, when land was excavated and buildings constructed, when underground vaults and tunnels were installed, there's no clear record of what was there before or who authorized what. The fire created a blank slate legally as well as physically. I kept looking for accounts of what else they found during the 1901 to 1911 rebuilding. The locomotive is documented. The char line is documented. The construction of underground vaults is documented. But those are the discoveries that were too big to hide or too obvious to ignore. What about the other excavations? Over 1,000 building permits issued in the first few months. Deep foundations required for many of them. Utility lines installed throughout the city. Sewer systems, water mains, all requiring excavation. All during a period when there's no clear record of what was underneath because the courthouse records burned. The newspaper accounts from 1901 to 1902 focus on the fire, the destruction, the rebuilding progress, architectural designs, funding sources, construction timelines, but very little about what they encountered underground. It's not hidden exactly, it's just not emphasized, not discussed, and not considered remarkable. File it under urban development and move on. The only reason we know about the locomotive is because John C. Christian happened to be there in 1971 and chose to talk about it decades later, despite being told to keep quiet. The only reason we know the char line still smelled fresh 70 years later is because he mentioned poking around in it after hours. The only reason we know about the 1962 bomb shelter conversion is because Gary Sass spent years clearing out the vaults and found the water dated 1962. These discoveries weren't publicized. They weren't hidden either. They were just filed away as trivia. Interesting footnotes to Jacksonville's history, not significant enough to investigate further. But when you put them together, a question emerges. What else is down there that hasn't been excavated yet? Jacksonville today sits on top of multiple levels of history. The modern city at street level, the early 1900s bank vaults and tunnels beneath that, the 1901 char line beneath that, the riverbed and docks that collapsed during the fire beneath that, a locomotive buried in river mud 70 years before being rediscovered, and then reburied beneath a skyscraper, and potentially other levels we don't know about because we haven't dug that deep in those locations. The fire created the opportunity to rebuild completely, above and below ground. And during that rebuilding, during the same decade that saw massive infrastructure projects in cities across America, Jacksonville built extensively underground. For banks, for railroads, for reasons documented and reasons not discussed. The 1901 fire is not hidden. It's one of the most documented urban fires in American history. The third largest after the Great Chicago Fire and the 1906 San Francisco Fire. The rebuilding is celebrated. Henry Clutho is praised. The St. James Building is a point of pride. But the underground infrastructure built during that same period? That's treated as a historical curiosity, something for local historians to give tours about. Not something to investigate or question. A locomotive buried 30 feet underground and left there because excavating it would delay construction? That's considered reasonable. Practical even. A char line from 1901 still smelling fresh in 1971? Interesting footnote. Not worth deeper examination. Bank vaults converted to bomb shelters in 1962 that were then forgotten and filled with trash. Local color. Urban exploration content. All perfectly explained. All perfectly reasonable, except for the question nobody asks. Why build so much of it underground? Why during this specific decade? Why in so many cities at once? You can verify everything I've told you. The Great Fire of 1901 is documented extensively. The Jacksonville Historical Society maintains archives. The State Library of Florida has photographs. The rebuilding timeline is public record. Henry Clutho's architectural works are celebrated and protected. Many are on the National Register of Historic Places. The underground bank vaults exist. You can tour sections of them. The Jacksonville terminal tunnels exist, buried but intact. The locomotive under the Wells Fargo building is documented in John C. Christian's eyewitness account and in Jacksonville Magazine's 2018 article, What Lies Beneath. The 1962 bomb shelter use is documented in Gary Sass's historical tours. All of it real, all of it verifiable. The question is what it adds up to. A city burns to the ground in 8 hours. 2,368 buildings destroyed. All records of prior ownership lost. Rebuilding begins immediately. Within 2 years, more buildings than before. Extensive underground infrastructure constructed during the rebuilding, vaults 30 feet deep, tunnel networks, railroad passages. When excavating decades later, they find a locomotive buried in river mud, a char line that still smells of smoke, artifacts that workers are told to keep quiet about. And all of this happening during the same 1900 to 1920 period, when cities across America are raising streets and burying original ground levels, digging deep tunnels under lakes and rivers, moving massive populations, building enormous institutional structures, standardizing history and education. Is Jacksonville's underground just practical banking infrastructure? Or is it part of the same pattern we keep seeing everywhere else? The same pattern of digging deep, building underground, and then moving on without much discussion of what was found or why it was necessary. The fire gave Jacksonville a reason, a blank slate, a chance to rebuild correctly, modern, efficient. And part of that rebuilding involved going deep underground during the exact decade when other cities were doing the same thing for their own stated reasons. Chicago, raised streets for sewage. Seattle, raised streets for flood control. Cleveland, tunneled for water intake. Jacksonville, rebuilt after fire. Each city has its own story, its own explanation. But together in the same years, they add up to something larger, a coordinated transformation of urban infrastructure, above ground and below, during the exact period when the old world was being replaced with the new, when Tartaria disappeared from maps, when institutions consolidated control, when history was standardized, when children were relocated, when asylums were built, when Jacksonville burned and was rebuilt with bank vaults 30 feet underground and a locomotive buried in river mud. Now, the evidence is there, in the archives, in the abandoned tunnels, in the vaults converted to bomb shelters, in the char line that still smelled fresh 70 years later, all filed under urban development, all explained, all reasonable, all perfectly normal for the period, 1900 to 1920, the period when American cities were transformed completely, and nobody thought to ask why so much of it happened underground.